All right, well, this is a talk that I prepared for the celebration of the 60th anniversary of computer science and AI at the University of Edinburgh. Now, as you would expect with me being a networking person, I immediately thought of giving a talk about networking. And once I started doing the research, it became pretty clear that there was actually a nice sort of synergy in that a lot of interesting things happened with networking also over the last 60 years. And in fact, you could really trace back the origins of the internet to roughly 60 years ago, just like computer science and AI at Edinburgh. So that's the theme of the talk. And of course, it's going to be a little bit about networking history, given the title. It's also going to be a bit about my career, which is actually 60 years long if you count all the way back to when I was born. Perhaps more accurately, it's about 40-ish years of networking for me. And I'll throw in a few stories about my time at Edinburgh, where I was a student. And of course, the internet is a continually evolving thing. And so I'll also be talking about the current state of the internet and where I think it's going from now. And in fact, even in the last 2 weeks before I gave this talk, I was making changes as things were happening in the internet that were causing me to revise some of my thinking about where it's going. So, this is both the past, the present, and the future of networking with a bit of me thrown in. Well, let's jump into it. Well, here's me in 1985, the year that I arrived in Edinburgh. Hardly changed since then, I think you'd agree. And, as you can tell perhaps from the photo, I was a little bit confused when I arrived in Edinburgh in 1985. One of the things that I was a bit confused about was I actually didn't realize that in those days, computer science and AI were housed in two completely separate departments. So I was coming to Edinburgh actually in large part because I was interested in AI, but I was also registered in the computer science department. And so when I arrived, I found myself studying computer science, and that the people in the computer science department actually did not have a terribly high opinion of the AI department. I think it was viewed as perhaps not quite serious. The computer science department then, as it does now, had a very strong reputation for theory. The AI folks were doing all the stuff that was hot in AI in 1985, which, by the way, AI was absolutely having a moment in 1985, which was why I was interested in it. Well, as things turned out, I did not eventually pursue my interest in AI. I visited the department a couple of times. I sat in on a few classes, but I was kind of persuaded that if I really wanted to graduate, I should probably focus on computer science, and I did. And in retrospect, I actually dodged a bit of a bullet because AI was just about to enter one of the periodic AI winters when all the funding dries up and people decide it's not really going to deliver what it promised. Only time will tell if we're about to enter another one of those, because obviously AI is having another moment today. But anyway, somewhere in the intervening years, the two departments were merged, and today there is a joint School of Computer Science and AI at Edinburgh. Now, going back to the very beginning of all of this, Donald Mickey was the person who founded the AI department at Edinburgh. So in some respects, one of the people responsible for my showing up in Edinburgh. And this is a picture of his hands. And he's playing with a mechanical computer that he built to play the game of noughts and crosses. Now, this computer had a very interesting property, which is that it didn't know how to play noughts and crosses when you first built it, or when Mickey first built it, but over time, by playing against a human, it learned how to play noughts and crosses. So this is one of the very first examples of machine learning, and I've actually used this slide over the last half dozen years to explain in basic terms how machine learning works. And one of the amazing things is that the basic ideas have not changed all that much in 60 years, but a couple of big things have changed, which is why machine learning is so successful now. First of all, the machines are much bigger and faster than this collection of matchboxes. We have GPUs and TPUs and these sort of very highly parallel processing compute engines that can process vast amounts of data. That's one of the reasons why machine learning has moved on in leaps and bounds, particularly in the last few years. The other big shift, of course, is that we have massive amounts of data to feed into these machines. And where does all that data come from? Well, a lot of it comes from the internet. It's the fact that people put photos of their cats up on the internet, and in recent times, the vast troves of linguistic data that are on the internet have been used to feed the large language models. So there's a direct connection between the success of machine learning and the success of the internet. But there's another connection to networking, which is that it also was kicking off in the 1960s. Here are some of the foundational people and their work from the 1960s in the early days of packet switching. Len Kleinrock is very famous for his work on queuing theory. That's one of his textbooks on the left there. And Kleinrock wrote some of his first theoretical works about the theory of packet switching, although it was not yet called packet switching, back in 1961. JCR Licklider, who was an amazing visionary for all kinds of things from time sharing to networking, wrote down the early ideas for what he called an intergalactic computer network in 1962. Now, Licklider became the head of ARPA, and he sold this idea of a global computer network, if not necessarily intergalactic, to some other people at ARPA, and that eventually paved the way for the creation of the ARPANET, on which we'll have more to say in a moment. And then there were two independent people working on the early design of packet switching, Donald Davies in the UK and Paul Barron in the US, around the 64-65 timeframe. Both independently came up with designs for packet switched networks. Now, it's worth remembering that at this time in the 1960s, there was one very, very well-established network. It was the telephone network. So what was fundamentally different about packet switching was that instead of being a system optimized for voice communications, it was one optimized for computer-to-computer communications. And the fundamental idea that all of these people had was that you didn't need a continuous circuit to connect one computer to another. What you needed to do was to collect packets or bundles of data and then send them into the network and get them to be routed across the network so that they could arrive at the destination. A fundamentally different operation from circuit switching, and that was really what was going on in this early work, particularly the work of Davies and Barron, it was Davies who came up with the idea of calling these bundles of bits that could be sent from one computer to another. He gave them the name packet, and that name stuck. Well, it didn't take long for these ideas to be put into practice. And in 1969, we got the first messages sent across the ARPANET. This is an early ARPANET IMP, the interface message processor, which was effectively the early router of the internet. And the first few hosts exchanged messages in 1969. And very quickly, the ARPANET was built out to both cover the entire United States, or at least a large number of institutions on the coasts, plus a few in the middle. And you can even see, if you look closely, that by the early 1970s, there were a couple of connections off to Europe, one in Norway and one in London. So that's the state of the ARPANET in the early 70s. And around the same time, there was the early beginnings of the idea of internetworking. And there was a paper written in 1972 by Bob Kahn, in which he started talking about the early ideas of the internet, and he was quickly joined by Vint Cerf, and that was the early days of the internet, very directly following from the ARPANET. One of the amazing things is that the whole idea of internetworking was to connect together different kinds of networks. And there actually were very few networks around in the early 70s, but nevertheless, the idea was already entrenched that there would be multiple networks. And this is another area where I think there was a big difference of viewpoint between the packet switching world and the telephone network world, where the idea was there would be these different kinds of networks that would be interconnected. Well, let's jump ahead a little bit.